Good evening, you all. Hey, hey, everybody. You you all deserve the hand. Good evening and welcome to your Leadership Impact Forum. I'm James White, and I'm lucky enough to be on the Ascend team with about 9 of my colleagues here this week. Um, um, really excited for the week of programming that we have ahead, and excited to welcome most of you back, some of you for the first time, to Aspen Meadows. And Lori, Tiana, and Ro primarily have put together really exciting in-person and virtual agendas that we're really excited to jump into with you all this week, and want to offer a special welcome to those of you not able to be here with us in person, but who are joining us virtually. We know that you're here in spirit. We miss you, are thinking about you, and wish you and your loved ones well. As we prepare to share this space and fellowship together this week, we'd like to start by offering an acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of this land, some of the history that brings us here, and the beautiful teachings and traditions of indigeneity that have the potential to help us all live in better harmony with one another and with the world around us. As we do so here in Aspen, we invite those of you joining us virtually to research and reflect on the history of indigeneity in the places and spaces that you occupy. The online tool that we use to begin our exploration of that history can be found at native-land.ca. Long before the discovery of gold and silver brought Europeans to this area in the late 1800s, what is now Colorado was home to a wide array of Native American tribes whose descendants continue their traditions today. The Ute people are the oldest residents of Colorado. Before European colonization, they lived in harmony with their environment and traveled across Colorado's mountain ranges. They came to know not only the terrain, but the plants and animals that inhabited this land. The Ute developed a sacred relationship with their natural environment, practicing a respectful give and take with Mother Earth. Actions taken by Spanish colonizers, including genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal, led to a swift and sharp decline in Colorado's indigenous populations. The Spaniards' continued westward expansion in quest for land was in direct contrast to the indigenous population's reverence for Mother Earth, who believed that they did not own the land, but that the land owned them. Contact with the Europeans threatened a way of being that the Ute had known for centuries. The American Library Association estimates that roughly 50,000 people identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native reside in Colorado today. The state's two federally recognized tribes are the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute Indian. The Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Apache are among the other indigenous nations native to Colorado. Utes and other American Indians are our friends, they're our neighbors, and they're our colleagues with a present and a future as well as a past. So on our shared journey toward justice, it's important that we continue to examine the roles our institutions have played in marginalizing communities, that we lead the way to building a world that reconciles these injustices, and that we transparently recognize and celebrate how we all benefit from indigenous wisdom and culture. Ascend is fortunate to partner with indigenous leaders whose expertise and experiences help guide our work. And as always, we invite other partners and all of you to share feedback with us on that work and our journey toward justice. So with that, I would like to invite up to the stage our Executive Director and Aspen Institute Vice President, Ann Mosley.
Let's all say thank you to James for the perfect and beautiful opening. I said to James before, I don't really want to follow you because I just have to say my heart is so full being in this room with all of you. And I also, I feel like a very awkward Anne, seeing myself as like going to school in 5th grade to a new middle school, like, how do you do it again? just like sort of being in community. And I just wanted to, I think as we enter this space, there are two thoughts. One, hopefully we're going to be working at our heart, our spirit, our head, and our feelings. And big picture, because all of us share a North Star about what does it look like to have true intergenerational, just, equitable well-being and mobility for all. And so as James invites us all to think about the land that we're upon, and we think about the 800 years or more of the Ute people, and the swift introduction of European or white culture into Aspen when it changed and was renamed to Aspen, as we love the beloved trees and the roots. But it was a swift change that within 2 years changed the course in many ways for the Ute people and also for this land. And so, I think as we all come together because we see a vision for what we yearn for the world to be, part of that journey is being really eyes wide open about the history and the lessons, the experiences and the trauma and the pain, and to really learn, be accountable, and grow from. The other part is as we come as people to just the individuals and the rock stars and phenomenal people you all are, that it wasn't easy. Some people have been on planes and trains and out sort of in many different forums. And I've been one of the people on the Ascend team, generally always a pain in the ass. And virtual people, it's so great to have you with us as well. Hopefully Dan Porterfield's not out there. No, I'm teasing. Dan, please be here. But, have been yearning to be out of like the literal Zoom box, just like get me out. And now I find myself here like, oh, wow, now I'm here. And I just have to say, on behalf of all the Ascenders, this is our first in-person convening. And there is no other community that we would do this with. So, I wanted to sort of level set. The team has put together a beautiful program, and as you know, with the Ascenders, they think about every detail, every possibility, and I want to honor and thank each of them for the work they've done. And sticking with the beautiful theme of plant, cultivate, and harvest, the first part of planting is tilling the soil. Like, who's at the table? Who's in this room? And this is the first time our first Leadership Impact Forum. And rebuilding right. Leadership for an equitable and just future for children and families in our country. And so in this room, we have 4 cohorts of Ascend Fellows. Out virtually, we have representatives and colleagues from that community. And we think about the fabulous 4 cohorts. As you all know, you are all special, and each one of you is the best, and you all have your own personality. From inaugural, second to none, 3s up, slightly the never-ending, always to be, and also our beloved Colorado cutthroat trouts. All of you are amazing. It's also a really special honor to welcome the Soar Fellows. The Soar Fellows, so as we all know, the Ascend Fellowship, North Star, Family Mobility, Wellbeing, Shake It Up, and the Soar Fellows was the first fellowship created at the Institute. 1949, here we are. First fellowship ever created about the future of women and girls, grounded in gender, racial, and economic justice and intersectionality. And so the Soar Fellows, they got launched literally in the beginning of March 2020 and had sort of a whirlwind in Washington, and then we went online. And so for you all, this is the first time on your campus here in Colorado that is our privilege to share and open up. And so we welcome you, and I know all the Ascenders and the Soarers will be one. All of you come from as far as from across the country, as you all know, as well as Haiti. And so as we all are sort of just in this room, just like notice who you're sitting with, who's here and connecting, and also who's not in this room. because while we're going to be in seminars and cohort forums, we will also then be going to different workshops and small groups, but we will also be conducting alongside a virtual forum to try to bring as many along with us. So the last, and certainly not least part, I want to also really recognize and welcome the Ascend team. We have Ascenders here that you know very, very well, and there are Ascenders that are new, and it's also their first time on this campus, and it's delighted to have them here with us. And they will introduce themselves to you, seek them out. And I also really want to thank the Meadows staff, because this has been a really hard year for everybody. Folks that are in the service and hospitality, they have always been very kind and gone the extra step for all of Ascend gatherings because they believe in the work you do. So I thank you for that. And then last, we also have a few very special partners that are here, because this is an intimate gathering for us in many ways. Some, supporting partners, as well as we have some new moderators that will be joining us, and you'll get a chance to experience them in your seminars, as we're also thinking about the future scale and also diversifying the pipeline of moderators that also share the North Star and also believe in the Socratic method. So that's just a little bit of who is here in the room. I just wanted to share just a little bit about kind of the cultivating process. We've been on a journey with the Ascend Fellowship since 2012 to really think about but making a big bet on leadership. And it's kind of crazy because the big catalyst at that time was the Great Recession, which almost feels like a puppy problem when we think about where we are now. And we really believed that leadership was a key driver if you're going to make the kind of policy, systems, and community change. And leadership, as we say it with the fellows, it's all about you, and it's nothing about you. Because leadership is about what is within, it lies everywhere, and what we're able to sort of build and activate around us. And so we made a big bet, and we're also, in a second, I'll be talking about how we look to double down and build the scale. But there were a couple core things that were at the heart. And I share this because we look forward to your ideas and feedback because we're on this journey with you. But at the heart, there was a real belief that we wanted to explore, like, what does systematic opportunity take? Converse, or inversion, what does it look like to get and root out systematic oppression? And if you think about that from the internal to the external, it's an everyday quest and commitment. And so, at the heart of this work is thinking about, all of you are amazing leaders. You're, leading on levers of change. You reflect the full diversity of the talent and what is amazing about this country. And, we were in a conversation recently. This was really, you are the leaders that the world didn't even know they need, but they sure do now. So, kind of the values that come into this room that you all hold that have been at the heart of the fellowship around equity, racial, gender, economic, as core ones, thinking about the power of the Socratic method. And this is something that really was the ethos of the creation of the Institute, that self and system examination, to be able to have sacred space where to be able to whisper what is your greatest fear, to be able to sit with colleagues and play that through, that which is keeping you up at night and feels so heavy, and make that shift for kind of to hold lightly, which feels so heavy, and to never feel alone. And when I think about kind of what we're reading, all of us in the paper, that trust is at an all-time low in our country, in institutions, and kind of established leaders, when I think about the trust that's among Ascend Fellows, it's off the charts. And I kind of like to flip with, what would currency look like if we had a currency of trust, not like a currency of the T-bill? So I play with that and bring that into this room as there's trust within cohorts and some other relationships, but build upon that as we've got our precious time here together. So just a couple spotlights as we think about where we are and where we're going forward. We have a lot to harvest. We have a tremendous amount to harvest. I sometimes am shocked when I, had the privilege of showing up at the Institute around 2010 with an idea, and would anybody come to the party? return my calls. I just left a fancy job in philanthropy. And I got, with the team and with a conversation out throughout the community, building on really, let's fall in love with the problem we're trying to solve, not the solution we're trying to sell. And how do we first and foremost go to those that we seek to serve and really recognize the expertise and the wisdom of lived experience. So those have guided us along the way, and as you all know, you've done the work. We've, made a difference and a dent on how health and human services are happening in the public and nonprofit sector. I call it the $1 trillion sleeping giant. If we could just center that in families, kind of amazing. We've been rethinking, and you've been leading the way on mental health and well-being. You've been catalyzing conversations around racial equity, justice, healing, from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C., and throughout, and also within. Bringing a new conversation to higher ed that really says the next equity chapter must be centered in thinking about students who are parents and also caregiving. They are no longer invisible. So these pathways, these opportunities, and also from meeting families from the very beginning, those early years, and thinking about that. So there's so much more I could say. You all are doing the work, you know it, and we're going to play with it while we're here. The real invitation for us all is to relish and make the best use of this precious time we have together. Play with it. Be outdoors. Fill yourselves up. Fill one another up. Go deep fast. Love, trust, connect. If you ever have thought, and we've heard you sometimes say, oh gosh, I just need a brain trust. Well, you got a brain trust and you have a love trust. Ascenders, this is heartfelt work for us. And as we think about the doubling down that we have ahead, and I'm putting this out, there'll be time for a breakfast. We'll lay out strategy and ideas. Want to hear your ideas, and be woven throughout. But we are doubling down on believing in leadership. And so kind of concretely, we're going to be ramping up with annual launches of cohorts. We've built sort of a 2030 plan to sort of think about where are we now, what do we want to kind of be in 2030, what does it look like out in the world. So just later this week, you'll get early heads up on the next the 5th cohort of fellows. And they're as fabulous as any one of you. Welcoming then.
That's the craziest thing you've said so far.
Thank you, Reggie. But also, we've been privileged. We also are going to be, as we think about being deliberate, we have that same North Star, because sometimes people are like, what's the next new thing? And really, is there something that's that brand new? It's about, we think, doubling down or maybe looking at different perspectives or connecting in new ways. But staying with the North Star of family well-being and economic mobility and educational success, we're also going to be doubling down on the future of early childhood, care, and racial equity. And also reaching a little deeper. So as we grow, we're in different seasons of our leadership. How will you give back and continue to learn with and grow with others? So that's something we're super jazzed about. We're committed to the importance of strengthening and sustaining the Ascend Fellowship community, and in fact, family. And so sort of our building the team, cross-connecting with Ascend, but we're committed to doing a biannual leadership impact forum that brings everybody together to co-create and co-reimagine and just sort of have that chance for collective nourishment, replenishment, and renewal. And also, as we say, second to none, kick some ass. This is the piece where more to come, but we want to build this future with all of you. And so, this is a moment to just really make this what you want to be, what you want it to be for yourself, for your work, for one another. And it is truly a joy, a pleasure, and a privilege to be a part of this. So as we think about kind of going bold and disrupting, kind of theme of the day, we have a really special guest who is joining us tonight. And this is the only kind of special guest speaker, because we're really going to be together in conversation and in seminars and small groups. And we couldn't be blessed with a more fantastic kind of catalytic thinker and amazing person. And so it's truly my great personal pleasure to welcome Franklin Leonard back to the Aspen Institute. I had a chance to meet him in 2016, kind of amazing to think about the world in 2016, when he came as a speaker at the Ideas Festival. And if you just kind of think back to 2016, the kind of themes he was raising and discussing and electrifying the festival were around the themes of America's identity crisis, the mirror of pop culture, upending Hollywood from the inside, a conversation with Michelle Norris on the gatekeepers. Feels like, I think those are the themes for the next Ideas Festival, Franklin. But this, he's also most well known as the founder and CEO of The Blacklist, a complete disruptor of how sort of movies are made, scripts get read, and what gets to the audiences. He is literally sort of this well-known source for finding the best unproduced screenplays by writers of color and by getting those films made. So if I have the data, I'm sure the numbers are ticking up, but The Blacklist has raised up 1,000 screenplays. Of that, 325 have been produced. 300 have received Academy nominations, and 50 have won. The list and the accomplishments go on. The part that I would just share, because he'll come up and tell his story obviously far better than I ever could, but really challenging the way things are done. Is this the way business is meant to be? What does access, opportunity, quality, and the future look like? So with no more to do, Franklin and I were both talking, because this is both the first time we've been out of a box speaking, so you are totally my brother now. I'm with you. But so for Franklin, for you to take the time to come from LA and have this be the first audience that you speak in person with, that is an honor and a gift. And so welcome, and thank you for joining us, and please come up.
How's the audio? Doing all right? How's everybody doing? Good? I should probably start by saying that was an incredibly kind introduction, and there are definitely more catalytic speakers that are probably available to you, including some of you sitting here. But thank you for those very kind words. So I'm doing pretty well because I'm here, in an existential sense, given the state of the world, and I'm here in pretty much one of the most beautiful places in the world, as far as I can tell, just walking around over the last 2 days. And I hope that you all feel the same way, and that I don't ruin that with my comments. But I'm also feeling very anxious. This is the first time I've sort of given a speech in public since March 2020, and I got very comfortable doing them via Zoom. And hopefully I'm not too rusty. Also because in preparing for this, I took a peek at some of y'all's bios. Very impressive. And it's a little absurd to me that I'm the one standing on this stage, because it's pretty clear to me that I don't have much to teach about moving children and the adults in their lives to educational success, economic security, and health and well-being. Not really my ministry. But I've learned sort of two things in adulthood that I sort of rely heavily on, and one of them is that it's very presumptuous to assume that you can't be helpful to someone who asks for your help, because they know their needs better than you do. And so I'm going to rely on people who are smarter than I am to tell me that I might be valuable. And the second is that the only way to really communicate any information, but certainly in an area that you don't consider yourself an expert, is by telling a story and having a conversation. So that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you my story, and then we're going to have a conversation. And I'm going to buzz as quickly through my story as possible, which will be aided, as you've no doubt already realized, by the fact that I talk relatively quickly. And then we'll, sort of keep it interactive, because that will probably be more interesting. My story. I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. I promise you all this comes back. And my dad was in the Army. We moved around a lot when I was very young. El Paso, Texas, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, Germany for 3 years when I was very young, and then we moved to West Central Georgia, a city called Columbus, about 2 hours south of Atlanta on the Alabama border. I was a big nerd. For those of you who remember a television show called Family Matters and a character named Steve Urkel, you get the vibes. That was basically me. I was captain of the state math team. I took 10 AP courses. Like, I was that guy. And the upside of being a big nerd in high school and having absolutely no social life to speak of whatsoever is that I got into Harvard, and that's where I went to undergrad. And I went thinking that I would be a math major, and very quickly realized that there's a very big difference between being really good at math in Georgia and being really good at math at Harvard. There were 2 kids in the first class that I walked in, one of whom was 15 years old and had just proved part of Fermat's last theorem for n equals 3. He left after a semester to go to a postdoc program. The other one, a guy named Jacob Lurie, had won the Westinghouse science competition that year. He also won the McCarter 3 years ago, the Genius Grant, and is now a tenured professor at Princeton. So I made the right call by not being a math major. And ended up majoring in social and political theory, and I graduated in the year 2000. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, so I bounced around to a few jobs right after school. I moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and helped run a congressional campaign. I moved to Trinidad, which is where my mom's dad is from, and wrote a column for the Guardian newspapers. I took a job at McKinsey & Company as a business analyst. I'd been offered it during my senior year, deferred it because I didn't really want to be a consultant, and found myself a year later with no greater clarity about what I wanted to do with my life, so I figured I might as well take this job and pay down some of my student loans. And a year and a half into that job, I was very sure that I did not want to be a management consultant. Fortunately for me, my entire analyst class was laid off with 5-month severance. And so I didn't have to go to a job anymore. I was still getting a paycheck, and I finally had a little bit of room to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I realized that a lot of my time was being spent either reading about the film industry or watching movies. Now, growing up in West Central Georgia, it never really occurred to me that there were jobs in Hollywood other than actor and maybe director. It was very clear to me that I was not going to be an actor, and I did not have any training as a director. But the more I read about the industry, the more I learned there were all kinds of different jobs that were available to supposedly smart people. I just didn't know about them, and I didn't really know how to get there because it was more realistic that I would have been an astronaut, right, than I would have worked in Hollywood, growing up where I grew up. But I moved out to Los Angeles in March of 2003. By virtue of my sort of Harvard social network and sort of 1 degree removed from that, I ended up getting a job at Creative Artist Agency, one of the biggest agencies in Hollywood, on my second day in Los Angeles. That was a Thursday. I started on the following Monday. I was there for a year. I got my first executive job soon thereafter, and 6 months after I got that job, I got sort of poached and sort of hired to run development for Leonardo DiCaprio's film production company. I'm going to pause there for 2 reasons. One, I need to give some context about what a development job is, because the rest of what I'm going to tell you wouldn't make any sense if I don't explain that, and I'm guessing most of you don't know. And the second is I need to be clear about the fact that I'm not bragging about having a really cool job working for a celebrity, because I promise you there's nothing cool about that job. Basically what your job is to read everything. Every screenplay that's out there, every book, play every video game in 2021, read every cereal box in the hope that you might be able to find either a writer who can write Leonardo DiCaprio's next movie or a script that you and your boss can then go make. And if you're lucky and your boss is very generous, you can be involved in trying to get it made. But what it basically means is you're spending 40 hours a week reading screenplays, 20 hours a week taking phone calls from agents and managers, telling you to read their screenplays, and then calling them back to tell them that the screenplays they sent you were really not very good. And that was really how I found myself spending my time. This is not the worst job in the world. I'm not digging ditches. But weekend after weekend after weekend of taking a banker's box home full of screenplays and spending 20 hours a weekend reading screenplays that you walk back into your boss's office and they say, "Did you read anything good lately?" And you have to say, "No, I didn't. I essentially wasted 20 hours of my life." Not the most fun way to spend your time. And my mother, she only recently stopped doing this, but she would call me every week and ask me if my LSAT scores were still valid. Literally, I had been in the New York Times before she stopped doing this. And I really didn't want to go to law school. No offense to any of the lawyers here. I actually regret that decision semi-regularly. But so I was sort of stuck in this position that I felt like my job was to find good screenplays, and I wasn't doing a very good job at that job. And I guess I defaulted maybe to McKinsey thinking or my sort of math brain's approach to rigorously solving a problem and said, if my job is to find good screenplays, maybe the best way to do that is to ask people that are in a similar position to me, what are the great screenplays that you've read? And so in the fall, well, really in November of 2005, I emailed 90 of my peers who had jobs similar to mine and said, anonymously, send me a list of your 10 favorite unproduced screenplays that you read this year. In exchange, I'll send you back the combined list. I sort of aggregated all of those votes, ran it through a pivot table in Excel, output it to PowerPoint. Still very much a consultant. That became the first blacklist, right? And I named it the blacklist both as a sort of, a nod to the screenwriters who lost their careers during sort of the McCarthyite sort of hysteria of the 1940s and 50s, but also as a conscious inversion of the notion that black somehow connotes something negative. Right? I grew up in West Central Georgia. I remember being in English class and being told, if the cowboy's wearing a white hat, that's probably the good guy. If the cowboy's wearing the black hat, they're probably the bad guy. I think we were reading Shane. I was the only black kid at my small private high school that I've since realized was a segregation academy, thinking, inductively, don't love that logic. And so I'd said, one day I'm going to invert that and write a novel where everything's inverted. Still haven't done that, but I do look for ways to play with language from time to time. So I sent this list out and went on vacation in December of 2005, and I read a lot of the screenplays while I was on vacation, and these scripts were really good. They were better on average than most of the stuff that I was getting sent by the biggest, most important agents in Hollywood. And I was getting everything because I worked for a big star who, if he said he wanted to do your movie, you have a go movie. So came back from vacation, everyone's talking about this thing. I was sure that I was going to get fired, so I decided, one, I would never tell anybody that I had done it, and two, I would never do it again. And that was my plan going into the year. But everywhere I went for the first 6 months of the year, everybody's talking about this list, where did it come from, these writers are really good, et cetera, et cetera. And then in June of that year, I got a phone call from an agent at then William Morris, another one of the big Hollywood agencies that has since been swallowed up by a company called Endeavor. And this agent was pitching me on his client. It was a standard call that I got like every day from some agent. Hey, I have Leo's next movie. They never had Leo's next movie, but that was the pitch. And it was the same, I've already sent it to Brad Pitt's company, so you should probably read it tonight. It's really urgent. They didn't realize that the guy in my job at Brad's Pitt company was a good friend of mine, so we would just exchange notes all the time. But this agent ended this call in a way that I had never heard before, and it caught me completely off guard. He told me, listen, don't tell anybody, but I have it on really good authority. This is going to be the #1 script on next year's blacklist. Some of you are catching on. Yeah, there was not going to be another blacklist. This guy was lying. Because I was the one that created it, and I wasn't going to do it again, so there was no blacklist that writer could have been on. And here's the thing, even if I was, it's a survey. There's no heads up that anybody could have about anything being #1 because that's just not possible. No one knows what's going to be #1 until literally I count the votes at the end of every year. But this was sort of the first realization that I hadn't just solved the problem of finding good scripts for myself, I had solved it for a lot of people. And here was an agent calling me to sell me on the idea that the speculative notion of his client being on this list would have some economic value for that client, right? And that's really sort of proven to be true. And even if this guy wasn't terribly ethical, he wasn't wrong about the economic value of being on this list. If you look at the success of the scripts that have been on the list over the last now 16 years, I'll give you some updated numbers. There have been about 1,200 scripts on the list in 16 years. About a third of those have been produced, about 400 movies have been produced. They've made about $27 billion in worldwide box office. They've won 50 Oscars from 300 nominations, including 4 of the last 13 Best Pictures, and half of the screenwriting Oscars awarded over the last 14 years. Most recently, wait, I'm going to stop the applause, because here's the thing. I can't take credit for those movies, right? I didn't make them, I didn't direct them, I didn't do cinematography, I didn't do craft service. The artists who made them deserve the credit for the success of those films. Yeah, we can applaud them, sure. And also there was notably, and my mother was really happy about this since I still haven't gone to grad school, there was a Harvard Business School study that came out right before the pandemic that found that basically movies made from scripts on the blacklist, when controlling for factors like budget and studio release and the agency of the writer, those movies make 90% more in revenue than movies made from scripts not on the blacklist, which Yeah, it's pretty cool. And like I said, my mom's a very big fan of the HBS element of that. But what I think is really important about that is it confirms, I think, an instinct that everybody in the industry has, which is good storytelling is the best business plan, right? And the best way to find a good story is to start with a great script. But the way the industry has historically functioned around deciding what movies to make has oftentimes not been driven by this sort of fundamental truth that if you start with a good screenplay, you have the best chance of basically the best possible creative and financial outcomes, right? And really what we built was a tool that showed that the industry was actually very good at finding good scripts, but very bad about making decisions about what to invest in, because they had a series of conventional wisdom about what worked and what didn't. That ultimately wasn't true. I should also add that we've since, in the last 9 years, built a website that allows anybody on earth who's written an English language screenplay to upload their script, have it evaluated, and if it's good, we then tell everybody in Hollywood, hey, this is a really good script, you should do something with it. And it sort of operated on the fundamental theory that, okay, there's all this talent that's within the industry that's not getting discovered. What about all the talent that's not in LA and New York that's not getting discovered? And I would come back and ask people in the industry who had been there longer than I am, like, what is our talent recruitment process? Like, what is our infrastructure? And the answer was always like, well, enter the Academy screen rating competition. If someone, places in the top 100, we'll probably find them. But if that doesn't happen, move to LA, get a job at Starbucks, network until someone pays attention to you. And I don't think it's only because I'm a black kid from Georgia, but I think as a black kid from Georgia, I'm acutely aware of the way in which those kinds of access issues completely pervert a labor market. And just because you are a single mom in Chicago or a suburban dad in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, that doesn't mean that you're not a good screenplay. But if your kids come home from school and you're like, load up the minivan, we're moving to LA, you might not be the best parent. But you still might be a good writer, and it's really incumbent upon the industry to find you. In the same way that sports teams don't sort of rely on signing to their roster the best friends of the owners. I mean, you can do that, but you're not going to win very many games. We should be out in the world looking for the next Giannis and the next LeBron and the next Lionel Messi, because that's where the talent lies and that's where the value is. So this is the part where, that's obviously the standard speech. Now I'm going to get into the sort of quasi-specific thing that's a little bit more ambitious. There's long been in Hollywood a conventional wisdom about what works and what doesn't. Some of that is kind of innocuous, right? There was a movie, Lars and the Real Girl, that was nominated for Best Original Screenplay. That was number 3 on the first ever Blacklist. Incidentally, number 2 on that first Blacklist was Juno, which beat Lars and the Real Girl for the Oscar that year. And Jojo Rabbit was also on the list. And these are movies that, on their face, it makes sense to me why Hollywood doesn't greenlight the comedy set during the Holocaust, the dramedy about a young man who buys a sex doll and treats it like his girlfriend in order to get over emotional trauma. Fair play. If those movies don't get made, is it going to be a world-changing event? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. But there are far greater and more pernicious conventional wisdoms that sort of govern the way that Hollywood makes their decision that are dangerous, frankly. I'll give you a few examples. Audiences aren't interested in women-driven action movies. That is, if you ask anybody in Hollywood, really prior to maybe 2-3 years ago, or at least prior to Hunger Games, they would have told you, yeah, non-starter. And in fact, every studio but one passed on Hunger Games because of just this assumption that men will not go to female-driven action movies, but women will go to male-driven action movies, so let's just focus on the male-driven stuff. Another assumption is that black movies don't sell outside of the United States. And by the way, a lot of people in Hollywood still believe that. You can ask them point blank, and they'll tell you that, yeah, that's true. Here's the thing. There's no statistical backing for either of those claims. I've been in the industry for 18 years, and every time anyone has raised them, I've asked them, where's your facts? Show me the argument, show me the case study, show me anything that validates this claim as a fact pattern. They don't have it. And in fact, there have been multiple studies, most recently by Stacy Smith at the University of Southern California, that find that none of that is true. And if you think about it, it's pretty obvious, right? Titanic is a female-driven action movie. It did pretty well at the box office. Terminator is a female-driven action movie. Did pretty well at the box office. Coming to America made more than $200 million outside of the US in the mid-'80s. And everybody likes to say, oh, Black Panther proved that black movies could sell abroad. No, that's been true for as long as we've been making black movies. The only statistic that matters when it comes to predicting the box office of any film, both domestically and internationally, is what is the size of the budget, how good is the script, and how much marketing money did you put behind it. But all of these assumptions sort of governed what Hollywood did. And I guess what I'd sort of add, just very quickly, and then I'm going to sort of finish my story, and then we'll do the conversation piece, is that at the end of the day, a lot of this conventional wisdom comes from the fact that the people that run Hollywood are pretty much the same. In fact, there was a McKinsey study done earlier this year that found that Hollywood is actually the least diverse business sector at the highest level in American industry. Less diverse than oil and gas, less diverse than finance, less diverse than Donald Trump's cabinet was. And so, when you think about the fact that the industry is run by, and the decisions about what gets made is run by a bunch of white men, the assumptions about female-driven action movies, movies about black people, aren't terribly surprising, because they are sort of making decisions based on their perception of the world and not the world as it is. And so for me, and again, I am no expert at most things, conventional wisdom is more often than not convention and no wisdom. And it's incumbent upon us to constantly interrogate that, both for ourselves and for the organizations that we work in and the systems that we function within, both because it's the way to get to the right thing from a sort of moral and ethical standpoint, but more importantly, so we can do our jobs well. If we're relying on conventional wisdom that's fundamentally not true, we are not doing what we're doing well. And I'll give sort of my best example of that. That McKinsey study also found that Hollywood right now, because of anti-black bias, is losing $10 billion annually. I'm personally frustrated by the reality of anti-black bias in Hollywood because, well, I'm black. But I'm also frustrated because it means that the people that have been making the decisions about what to make and how to make it are bad at their jobs, and I and shareholders and boards of these companies should remove the people that are running these companies, again, not just for the moral and ethical reasons, but because the financial outcomes will be better if we have more diversity. Because at the end of the day, I can't control whether somebody goes home and is racist. They can do that on their own time. What I can do is try to make sure that their racism doesn't prevent them and me from getting the bag and making good movies and television. And so at the end of the day, my goal, and hopefully everybody's goal, is to do things based on the facts, not on what people assume. So yeah, let's do the conversation part, because that's a lot. I don't know. First day back, it's hard.
It was awesome. Well, we're doing it together. Amazing. Well, I have so many questions. I could stay up all night with you, but I'm going to practice generosity. So this is awesome. That was awesome. I'm sure this is not a shy group, so get ready to ask the questions. I have two quick questions. One's inner outer game. Do you want inner or outer first?
Your call. Dealer's choice.
Dangerous. So let's go inner first.
Go.
So, it's always easy breaking into Hollywood.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's easy. So I have to imagine, like, a lot of no's, a lot of people messing with your head or just experiences. Like, how did you get through, like, the stamina to kind of go, that breakthrough? Like, what was, like, kind of...
Well, I mean, I think this is the thing. It's actually easy to get into Hollywood if you know the right people. Like, I had one interview before I got my first Hollywood job. And it happened because a friend of mine from Harvard had gone to high school with someone who was an assistant at one of the big agencies. And so when I came to LA, I knew one person. I had a drink with her. A friend of hers stopped by and was like, hey, there's an agent at CA who's looking for an assistant. I think you guys would get along. Send me your resume. I sent it on a Wednesday. I interviewed on Thursday, was offered the job on Friday, and started on Monday. And I think that's, really true for a lot of people that work in Hollywood. But it's not because they got the job based on merit. Who knows if I got the job based on merit? They got the job because, their daddy works at another agency, or, their mother knew somebody, or their, sorority sister knew somebody. It's an access game. Hollywood loves to sort of claim that the industry is a meritocracy. It's not. it is really a product of who you know. If it was a meritocracy, 91% of the studio movies made in the last 10 years wouldn't have been directed by men. I don't think there's anything that's sort of innate to being born a man that makes you more likely to be a good director. But, the numbers certainly would suggest that.
Yeah, when as you were building, the blacklist and, changing from within, were there moments ever where, like, your own values were pushed that you had to work through before kind of like the breakthrough happened?
I would say no, but only because I'm really bullheaded. And I thank and blame my parents for this. Look, my attitude about working in Hollywood was, this is something that I'm interested in, it's something that I care about, but there are better ways to make money. And those opportunities will be available to me if I wash out of this. And so I've never been terribly, I think the only compromise that I made was sort of working in environments that I knew that I couldn't do or aspire to the things that I most wanted to do. So I went and worked for Universal Pictures, a studio. They're not making the movies that I'm most interested in. I got to work on Fast and Furious 5, had a great time, very proud of that movie, but it's not what I aspire most to in the arts. But I worked there so that I would have the experience and the resume that would allow me to do the things that I wanted to do down the line. But when it comes to sort of compromising my morals and ethics, no, I'm much more likely to tell the people who've asked me to do that that's what they're doing and that they should ask me to do something else, which is probably why I never lasted very long in a lot of corporate environments.
Yeah, appreciate that. Posing the question back, that kind of shifts the accountability.
Well, I'm very impatient. I don't really have time for nonsense. I think the older I get, the more that's true. And so if you ask me to do something that I have a problem with, I'm gonna ask the question back to you. It's like, I just want to be clear. It sounds like what you're asking me to do is this. I'm sure I'm misinterpreting it. Are we on the same page here? And that will change the dynamic oftentimes. And if it doesn't, then we have a problem and I may need to look for a new job.
Appreciate it. Well, before I go to the outer question, I want to, is there any questions from the audience? And if you do, just raise your hand and Shilpi, and introduce yourself. 1 second, mic is coming.
There we go.
Thank you. Shilpi Niyogi, I was actually privileged to hear you here in 2016 in the Michelle Norris interview and follow you on Twitter. And so this is a weirdly Twitter-driven question.
Okay.
You raised a question the other day when suddenly Jeff Bezos was complimenting Netflix.
Yeah.
And I got to ask, what do you think is going on with streaming, and what does that mean for the old studio system? Is this sort of meet the new boss, same as the old boss, or are things really changing?
It's a great question. A little context for those of you who don't follow me on Twitter. Saturday night, Jeff Bezos tweeted praise to Ted Sarandos and Reed Hastings for their success on Squid Game, a TV show that if you haven't watched, I highly recommend it, with the caveat that it is very dark and very violent, but it is very good. I retweeted it and said, something's up, and then landed here yesterday to find out that Jeff Bezos had retweeted me to say, no, just a statement of admiration, which frankly sounds like something a Bond villain would say, but that's neither here nor there. I'm sure he does just admire what Ted Sarandos and Reed Hastings have done with Squid Game. Look, the industry is changing a lot, and the internet has sort of driven a lot of that. I think that what's really interesting about it is, I think we're seeing these sort of violations of conventional wisdom here too. The traditional studio model was make a movie, put it in movie theaters, and as many theaters as possible, create a marketing campaign that would drive as many people to that theater opening weekend as possible, because that dollar figure that you make opening weekend will determine all of your downstream sort of revenue and profit. Netflix doesn't care how many people watch their movie opening day, or opening week, or opening month, or opening year. Netflix cares that the aggregate content available on Netflix makes it so that you never say, wait, why am I paying for Netflix again? Right? Amazon, sure, they love to make a lot of money and win a lot of awards for their content, but really it's a marketing tool for Prime, because they know that once you own Prime, you're going to spend 10x as much on their platform. So it ends up being a profit-positive marketing thing for where the real money is. Apple, similar dynamics. What I'm really fascinated by, though, about streaming services is that means that you sort of have unlimited shelf space in a digital environment, which means that you're not sort of relying on making these decisions of, well, if we make this movie, then we shouldn't make this movie because this is the movie that needs to come out on this weekend. Netflix put out, I think it was between November and December, like 10 black movies and TV shows in the span of 8 weeks. There hasn't been a major media conglomerate that's done that in a year, ever, right? So I think you're seeing a proliferation. There's just more content, and so more people are going to have access. And you can justify sort of having niches of content because you can draw those people into your content thing, and you don't have to justify spending X amount of dollars to have your movie in 3,000 theaters. So I'm optimistic about the potential, but I'm also vigilant about looking at the numbers. And the numbers don't suggest that the streaming services are doing a terribly better job on the diversity front. Netflix put out their own internally researched study and then the sort of headline of which was, look how well we're doing. But if you dig into the study, not doing so well. Not doing that much better than any of the other traditional studios or any of the other streamers on a lot of fronts, including like the number of diverse showrunners and all of these things. So I think there are opportunities. I think who's running these companies will largely determine whether those opportunities end up existing. But look, I've been a black man in America for 42 years. I would say that I am optimistic, but only because of my belief in the talent of all of these people that are coming through the system and storming the doors down. So a lot of these companies have a choice. You can either not get it and run the risk of your company becoming irrelevant, or figure it out or hire people who do.
Well, pivoting on that, that's like so aligned. It's a different sector.
Yeah.
When you think about the Aspen Fellowship, opening up who's in leadership, who has decision making, how are you opening doors and thinking about power?
Yeah.
Do you have lessons learned or thoughts for the Aspen Fellows about kind of the power of culture, or just even what you've maneuvered for the change they're seeking, be it policy or in the field of delivering services or practices, or changing the conversation?
Yeah, look, this may be a little self-serving, but I happen to believe that culture lives downstream from politics lives downstream from culture. There was a 13th century Scottish poet named Andrew Fletcher who said essentially, let me write the songs of a nation, and basically, what do I care who writes the laws? Because what we see for hundreds, if not thousands of hours a year is likely to determine how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and how we see each other. And so, I don't think it's a coincidence that, for example, at no time in Hollywood history have 10% of the movies at the studios been directed by women, and we find ourselves in this Me Too moment, right? Because, men making movies, by and large, have normalized what appropriate male-female dynamics are, and we're starting to realize that, hey, wait, maybe those are not acceptable, right? I think a lot of women already knew they weren't acceptable. But again, they were also told, no, this is what is acceptable, and if you don't think it is, you're the one who's in the wrong. I think similarly, the myth of sort of black criminality goes all the way back to the movie Birth of a Nation, which is Hollywood's first ever blockbuster, something the industry still hasn't reckoned with. Literally rebirthed the Klan. And yet still, to this day, I think, looking back over the last 10 years, 60% of the gang members in Hollywood movies are black, but even the FBI will tell you that only 30% are. I think there was a 5-year period where 50% of the Latinx immigrants shown on television were shown engaged in some criminal activity, despite the fact that almost every sociological study suggests that immigrant communities and Latinx immigrant communities specifically are actually safer from a crime perspective than non-communities. So, but again, why do you think people in Alabama are chanting "Build the Wall"? It's not because they know Latino criminals. It's because they saw them on TV, right? That, I think that we have to reckon with, the industry has to reckon with the fact that no matter how many ribbons we wear on red carpets, what we make and who we let make things doesn't reflect those values that we claim. And two, I think I would take the applause, but these are just facts. And two, I think it's important that we all think about how we share stories to communicate with each other. Because I often think that, and I sort of joke about it in the context of giving a speech, but very few people want to be lectured to. But you can lecture really effectively if you can tell them a story that they find really interesting. And I think that is really just a valuable tool for anyone trying to create any change, because I find it to be a hyper-effective way of communicating that oftentimes you can sort of get people before they realize that they got, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, my friend.
Thank you. Dan Varner from Detroit. This world that we live in now, it seems to me, produces a much more fragmented narrative. So the storytelling is much more fragmented, right? You can plug into what you want to plug into, as opposed to having kind of the big blockbuster movie that everybody talks about and drives culture. And so what's the impact, from your perspective, of the fragmentation of that storytelling on everything downstream?
I think it's a good thing, and I think this is an unpopular opinion. Well, I'd say two things. One, everybody still saw Black Panther. Everybody still goes to see the Star Wars movies, right? These movies, there are still movies that come out every year, maybe not during the pandemic, but that are making $1 billion. These are things that a lot of people are seeing, and they're more successful even on a per ticket, like a number of ticket basis, than a lot of the movies that have been successful historically. Similarly, you see something like Squid Game, right? That got made in Korea, but is now the #1 movie on Netflix in 90 countries. So I would challenge the thesis that there are not these sort of cultural phenomena that are shared across gender, race, age, community, nationality, whatever. I think there's still, and one of the reasons I love film and television, it is one of the places that sort of binds us as community, because we share these stories. I was in Shanghai and ended up in a 3-hour conversation about Marvel movies, right? We barely spoke a common language, but we could talk about that. It's also why I love soccer, right? Because I can go anywhere in the world, and that's a common parlance. On top of that now, because of the decreasing cost of making things and the decreasing cost of distributing things via the internet, right? Literally Apple's leaning into this with their cinematic mode on the new iPhone. There is a lot more stuff, and that results in more fragmentation, because you can find the thing that you're really into that maybe nobody else is into. But I think that's really important too, because there are all kinds of sub-communities that exist all around the world, and you're going to be able to find things that you're into that may bind you to a community that you don't readily have in your own hometown, in your own place. Look, I grew up in West Central Georgia in the 80s and 90s. I was a black nerd. I used to joke that the only way my life would have been more difficult in high school was if I had been gay, but my best friend was, so it didn't really matter. It might as well have been anyway. I think about the fact that for him, he didn't know that he knew, that, but there were obviously other gay people at our school because, people were closeted. But he didn't feel like he had a connection to that community at all. He was like, it's just me. What is life like? What is life like for other people that are like me? I think that fragmentation is a really good thing. And I think that it's fascinating that now, because of the internet and because of content, gay kids in my hometown can go online and be like, yeah, it does get better, and now I have a social group of friends that we're bonding over this content, and I can see all of these different versions of the way my life might be. That wasn't really possible 30 years ago when I was a kid, right? At best, I could go to the movie theater at the Carmike Theater, downtown Columbus, Georgia, every week and see whatever the big movie was, but my face wasn't on screen. My best friend's face wasn't on screen. All the women that I knew, for the most part, face wasn't on screen in a leading role. But now we can find that stuff, and increasingly, Squid Game's a great example, all Korean cast, all Korean language, all of a sudden those stories end up being the most successful thing in the world.
Mark.
What role do capital markets play in this? You mentioned, was it 19 billion that was lost, something like that?
$10 billion a year.
$10 billion a year. Normally, markets correct themselves, particularly if the products are failing. So will the international markets rush in, kind of like the automobile industry when Japanese car makers came in? Or how's the market going to correct itself? Because consistently losing billions of dollars, the capital markets eventually won't usually support that.
Yeah, I guess the big question is what people love more, white supremacy or money? And I think that the answer up to now has been the former. Right? So, again, it's like, which do you want? Do you want the $10 billion a year, or do you want to preserve a legacy system that enshrines and celebrates white supremacy? Hollywood has given us our answers since 1920, right? It's not like we're all of a sudden losing $10 billion a year. We've been losing that money for a long time, but the fact of the matter is the people who are running the show are like, oh, no, that can't be right. And the reason I initiated the study from McKinsey. I was a former employee there. They announced after George Floyd's murder, we're going to commit $250 million in pro bono consulting specifically focused on racial economic equity. And I hit them up and said, if you want to do that, a great place to study it is Hollywood. And they saw the vision, and they came out with that. And, somewhat surprisingly, the response from a lot of the people, who this study comments on are like, those numbers can't be right. Now, any other time they pay McKinsey to come in and do that work, they are not saying, oh, those numbers can't be right. But somehow, on this issue, it's either, oh, those can't be right, or, you know what, we've got it from here.
Or it's a monopoly.
Well, look, or it's a monopoly, but here's the thing, I actually don't think it's oligopolistic. It has been since its founding. But the reality is that there's constant movement between, at the top level from one company to another, and ends up functioning essentially as one. But again, I think the fundamental idea, and this is what I always say on panels, and it frustrates a lot of the people that I'm on panels with, it's like, look, if you're one of these people running a company, odds are, just statistically, 40 to 50% of the people that have these jobs do not have them based on merit. They have them based on sort of the only affirmative action that exists in Hollywood, which is in favor of white men, right? Just, again, statistically, we're just like running the numbers, and you assume that this talent is distributed equally. A bunch of those people are not the best people for the job. So if there's a recognition that that money is being lost because of it, you would expect the capital markets to come in and shareholders to say, I'm losing money because you're either racist or incompetent, or both, but either way, unacceptable going forward. Or those companies or the capital markets are going to say, who can solve that problem? Sure, maybe we're losing that money, but it's not like we can replace these guys with someone who can do the job better.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, I'll put a question differently, right? We make assumptions. We'll go just further to the conventional wisdom thing. We, as a nation, have made an assumption that the best person to lead the country is a man who is white, over the age of 50, preferably over 6 feet tall. At some point, we probably should have realized that that's not necessarily the best predictor for success, right? That's not to say that white men over 50 who are over 6 feet tall can't be good presidents, but there are a whole bunch of other people who might be good presidents too. The market hasn't solved that problem yet, but it's because there's all of these structures and systems within the market that prevent the mass of people who are either customers or citizens from actually changing those things. And I can make more pointed political comments about the parties at this point, but I'll reserve from doing that right now.
So I'm going to do one wrap-up question, and then we'll go to close. But I think you're putting out like white supremacy and the markets, and I want to hold it to the themes and the work and the disruption and the challenging of the conventional wisdom, knowing that this is in the ether, the waters, the heart of what we're working on, because all of these are in all of our systems. So what? And so you hold the belief of the greatest distance between two people is a story.
Yeah.
Is there a chance to power story to bridge, or bigger disruption? I don't know, just your thoughts for us as we think about the policy, how the business of working with families so that and Andrea, if you have a quick tie-on.
Yeah, because that's a big question.
I know, I couldn't
about.
let you go with at least
No,
think
So
about
the question I was going to ask, which follows that, is you identified a data collection process that had the strength to disrupt a practice,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So I think what Anne's trying to ask, which was the question I was going to ask,
Thank you.
how do
But
This
then
is
I'll
a big
ask another
save.
question.
Well done. Yeah.
how
You
do
smacked me.
how do we think about an analogous process to disrupt how people think about poverty?
And then use the executive order on racial equity.
I think that without knowing the specifics of the dynamics, it's very hard to say. I think that what it comes down to for me And I think the thing that I've learned, both because of the blacklist, but then also this McKinsey study and other things, is that we just have to be rigorous about challenging the things that we take as law that rest on assumptions and not data, right? So in Hollywood, it was these things are possible and these things aren't possible, right? And the blacklist survey really wasn't consciously trying to undo that. It was just saying, what do you love? And then it just so happened that when those things got made, it sort of proved this thesis that what Hollywood was choosing to invest in was actually not the things that they should be investing in, or there was a slightly different portfolio investing approach. But at the end of the day, all of that, like that upending happens because you sort of have receipts that the system is wrong. And so for me, and anybody who follows me on Twitter knows that this is sort of how I roll, like I don't show up without receipts. You know, if I'm gonna make an argument, I'm literally gonna have like, 5 links ready in case somebody tries to come back at me. So I'm like, look, here's the numbers. This is not an opinion. This is, in the McKinsey thing, it's like, this isn't me saying this, it's McKinsey saying this, noted social justice warriors McKinsey and Company, right? They're just wokesters out here trying to get more black people in movies. And so I think it's really about presenting that evidence and then being, again, sort of bullheaded about it. It's like, look, if you have better evidence than I do, by all means, please bring it. But here are the facts. And unless you have facts that are sort of incontrovertible that make a better argument, this is the fact pattern. And let's go with that. And again, I don't know, I say all of this with deep insecurity, not knowing the specifics of y'all's realities, because I imagine they're very different than Hollywood. And I hope that they're very different than Hollywood for your sakes. But that's kind of the best I've got, I think.
All right, facts and heart. Last question, because Mark Gilmes is all the way from Port-au-Prince, Haiti.
Oh, right.
Soar Fellow. Mark, love, hear what you're thinking.
All right, hi. And I hate talking in public, so this is really, it took a long time for me to get to this point. It's sort of like a comment question. From what I understood, there's a couple of things that you said. One is the power of a story and the power of facts.
Yeah.
And can that be the disruptor? So giving facts without a story becomes boring and people don't want to listen, they turn off. But putting that story and giving that facts, or giving a story without facts becomes this sort of like...
The story without facts is fiction.
Right,
so yeah.
It is fiction, right. But in a sense, where we're trying to sell something, and you actually said something in the start, which I love, is fall in love with the problem you're trying to solve. And
Hat
not
tip
the
and
solution you're
Kayla's.
trying to sell. So if we're saying the problem is the disruptor at this point and helping us in understanding how to tell the story and making sure that you interweave those facts into that story so that that becomes the disruptor. So you're challenging and you're creating that vision in the head, but you're also giving the facts to say, this is where it stands. And if we're talking about poverty, can we change the narrative of poverty by giving some of the facts with those stories?
I think that's right. I think that facts without stories without stories to sort of humanize them are just sort of facts, right? They're just like bullet points on a sheet of paper. I'm a very big believer in trying to humanize facts by telling the stories of the people that those facts represent, right? And I think that that's, in order to tell an effective story, I guess maybe this is actually something that I could have leaned into as well. People always ask me, like, what's a good screenplay? Right? And at the end of the day, it's like the Supreme Court in pornography, like, when you see it. But that actually is the Supreme Court's
That is, I
definition
know.
of pornography,
I was
which
just
is
doing a
insane.
case study
It's
on
still
that.
insane to me. But ultimately, it's really about getting people to care about the people that you're talking about and getting them invested in what happens next, right? On a sort of fundamental level, you want to, there's this manifesto by the Japanese animator Hayao Miyazaki, and actually I have this quote sort of on my screen at home, and he basically says that a popular movie has to be full of human emotion, even if it's base. The entrance should be low and wide so that everyone can be welcomed in, but the exit should be high and purified. It shouldn't be anything that emphasizes or enlarges the lowness, right? And I sort of return to that often in terms of like the kind of movies that I want to make, and also like what is something that is likely to be popular. It can't be pretentious. It can't be the kind of thing that's like, look, you got to come to me. It's like, no, you have an audience that you're trying to communicate with. Go to them and hook them and then take them on a journey and send them out on the exit in this sort of high and purified place that's sort of full of human emotion. Because when and he talks about this later in the manifesto, when people leave a movie theater or watch a TV show, they re-emerge into the world with eyes anew. And you don't know how incremental or infinitesimal that change is, but across a large enough number of people, that change is ultimately undeniable. The other thing, and since we're about to close, I'll reference one of my other favorite quotes, and that's from Tupac Shakur, who right before he was murdered was asked this question. I think it was by MTV, and they were like, Tupac, do you think your music's going to change the world? And he was like, that's a dumb question. But he's like, I'll tell you this, my music will change the minds that change the world. He's like, if I keep telling people how messed up it is out here, maybe someone will think to clean it up. I think that ultimately, that's the potential of storytelling, is that if you can sort of communicate emotionally how the world is messed up, people may be more inclined to try to fix it.
Thank you, Franklin. And Mark, thank you for that last question, because I think about the work we're going into, and one of the things that we share as kind of a commitment to having effective equity policy and system change is having parents, caregivers, families in the conversation. Yeah. As co-creators, co-designers, I'm trying to sort of soften Franklin up about coming back. Maybe there's ideas about some of the stories.
I think I might be able to help you find more valuable people than me there too.
It's expanding the circle. It's expanding the circle. That story and the data and the numbers and the minds and the hearts and the stamina. So I could keep Franklin here literally at the Institute, DC, Meadows, or even California. We'd open up an LA office for you. But thank you for honoring us with making the trip and letting us be your first kind of getting back on the
Yeah, hopefully I'm not too rusty.
Fabulous. We appreciate you, and thank you.
No, thank you for having me. All right.